It's a pleasure to be here. I was here in 1991, and I think they thought that I was of a different persuasion ideologically. They told me beforehand, they said, "John, we're already thinking of having you back every year." Well, I haven't heard from them since, so if that tells you anything. So that the theme of this talk this afternoon is you cannot raise children in two entirely different ways and arrive at the same outcome. I don't have to tell most of you here that what is going on and what is called parenting in America today is vastly different from the manner in which you were raised. I was born in 1947, went to school, first grade, never went to kindergarten. Went to first grade in 1952. Went to high school in 1961, graduated in 1965, went to Western Illinois University. No one's ever heard of it. It belies the idea that you need to go to the right college. People come up to me, people our age, and I'm being a little loose here, our age. I travel the country almost constantly giving talks hither and yon. And most people think I'm talking about parenting, which is in a way true, but I'm really talking about child rearing. People come up to me, people who are our age, and ask me, what are these young people doing? What are they doing? Because most people our age, unless they have my background and have spent their professional lives as I have, examining what they are doing, don't understand what they're doing. Because it bears absolutely, I could say little, but it doesn't bear little. It bears absolutely no relevance whatsoever to what was being done with us when we were raised in, say, the 1950s. You can't raise children in two entirely different ways and arrive at the same outcome. This has been verified time and again. The mental health of children in the 1950s and early 1960s was a whopping 10 times better than the mental health of children today. Child mental health has been deteriorating as the mental health professions have proliferated. Now, what does that tell you? I'm a psychologist. I long ago fell out of favor with my colleagues, and I fairly long ago realized that psychology is a pseudoscience. I'm talking about clinical psychology. It is a pseudoscience. Most people don't realize there are no practice standards in clinical psychology. You go to a psychologist, he might be a behaviorist. You go to another psychologist, he might be a humanist. You might go to another psychologist, he might be a gestaltist, and so on and so forth. No practice standards whatsoever. Would you go to a physician not knowing what school he represented? Anyway. I went to first grade in 1952. There were 50 children, 50 in my class, Charleston, South Carolina. There was one teacher. Most of us came to first grade, as is the case with many of you in this audience, not knowing our ABCs. My mother eventually obtained a PhD in plant morphology. My mother taught at the University of Illinois. My mother was world-renowned for the research she did in her field. My mother was a single parent for most of the first 7 years of my life. My mother did absolutely nothing prior to my going to first grade by way of teaching me anything academic whatsoever. This woman who valued education more than she valued anything else in life did not teach me my ABCs, did not teach me how to read, did not teach me number facts. I went to first grade just having played for 5 or 5.5 years. That was true of most people in our generation. We came to first grade. If we went to kindergarten, which I did not, if we went to kindergarten, kindergartens then were non-academic for the most part. So I am sitting in first grade with 49 other students who have come there, most of whom, rare exception perhaps, don't know their ABCs. I know they didn't know their ABCs because our first grade teacher spent probably the first 3 or 4 weeks of school teaching us our ABCs. And then she went into phonics. The average first grade class size in America in the early 1950s was 35, taught by one teacher. Today, the average first grade class size in America is between 20 and 25, call it 25. There's a teacher and 1 or 2 aides. So the adult-child ratio in today's first grade class, let's just say there's only 1 aide, is 1 to 12. The average class, first grade class size in America, 1952, the year that I went to first grade and sat in a first grade classroom of 50 children, was 1 to 35. Most of us came to first grade not knowing our ABCs. Most kids today come to first grade already reading. At the end of first grade, this is verifiable, we were reading at a higher level than today's kids. Sitting in what today would be considered criminally overcrowded classrooms, getting very little individual attention. You do know that today's parents believe that individual attention is the key to early success in school. This is not borne out historically at all. We got very little individual attention. When you're sitting in a first grade class of 50 children, you don't get individual attention. And you very quickly notice that the kids who are getting individual attention are not getting good attention. You very quickly conclude you don't want individual attention. We outperform today's kids, and when I say today's kids, we outperform kids since the 1970s at every single grade level. Our mental health 10 times better. And yet the mental health professions in America came along in the late 60s and early 70s and promised us parenting. A word came into the vocabulary, American vocabulary, in 1970 with the publication of a book by a psychologist named Fitzhugh Dodson, How to Parent. It was the first time the noun had been used as a verb. The mental health professions promised us parenting nirvana, parenting utopia, if we would only follow their advice. And we had become a fully fledged progressive culture in the 1960s. Progressivism had replaced traditionalism in America. Progressives believe new ideas are better than old ideas. They believe in the steady and always improving evolution of ideas. And I was there. I was in graduate school in the late 60s, early 70s. And I was swept up in this enthusiasm. And I attached myself to this. Our first child was born in 1969. I was 20 years old. My wife was 19. We are still married. Applause, please. Thank you very much. So we started raising Eric according to these new ideas, which stood in sharp contrast to the way that we ourselves had been raised. Nonetheless, we believed that people with capital letters after their names knew what they were talking about. Generally true in physics, mathematics, hard sciences. Historically, not very true in psychology. In January of 1979, 80 actually, my wife and I were sitting, I was 79. We were sitting in Eric's third grade classroom after school with his third grade teacher, Mrs. Stewart, who told us that, this is January, mind you, that she was definitely not going to promote Eric to the fourth grade. That he should not have been promoted to the third grade, and she had no intention of repeating the mistake the second grade teacher had, out of the goodness of her heart, made. And I'm sitting there stunned. Mrs. Stewart, how can you make a decision like this halfway through the school year? Well, I knew you would ask that question. And my answer is in two parts. Number one, your son came to me reading a year behind grade level. He is now reading a year and a half behind grade level. You can do the math. I've been teaching children to read for over 20 years. I know how to teach children to read, Mr. and Mrs. Rosemond, but I cannot teach a child to read who does not pay attention or do what I tell him to do. Your son argues with me about everything. He will not do anything I tell him to do. He does not pay attention. On the playground, he creates conflict constantly. He throws tantrums on the playground, Mr. and Mrs. Rosemond, full-blown tantrums. He was throwing full-blown, screaming, flailing fits in public places. He was 10 years old. Mr. and Mrs. Rosemond, the second part of my answer to your question is, your son is the worst behaved child I've seen in 20 years of teaching. By today's standards found in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, he qualified for 4 diagnoses. ADHD, scale of 1 to 10, 10. Oppositional defiant disorder, scale of 1 to 10, 10. And I'm not exaggerating. Bipolar disorder of childhood, scale of 1 to 10, 10. And a learning disability, scale of 1 to 10, 7 and rising. My wife and I went home. We talked about nothing for 3 days but the conference with Mrs. Stewart. How did this happen? We are responsible people. We love our children. How did this happen? It was my wife, Willie, Nee Wilma. I told her when I met her, I said, you know, I'm going to marry, and I can't marry Wilma. Has to do with a television program I watched as a kid. So she became Willie at that moment in time. It was actually Willie who said, well, you know, you and I made a conscious decision when Eric was born and you were in graduate school and you were reading all this new stuff, that we were going to raise our children in a way that was completely removed from the way we ourselves had been raised. And look where that's got us. Don't you think, this is exactly what she said, don't you think that if we had raised our children the way we ourselves had been raised, after all, when we were coming up, we didn't know anyone, either of us, who behaved as badly as Eric behaves. Don't you think that if we had continued that tradition, that everything would be okay? And it was like being kicked upside the head by a mule, as we say in the South. So Willie and I, in a matter of, it took about 3 weeks, we just turned our child rearing, or it was parenting then, we turned it 180 degrees and pointed it back at the early 1950s. And 3 months later, let me tell you one thing we did. We sat down with Eric and we said, Eric, you know, we had a conference with Mrs. Stewart a few days ago. Yeah, I was wondering what you talked about. Well, I'm going to come straight to the point with you here. She's not promoting you to the 4th grade, she says. I'm not going to the 4th grade. I said, I didn't say you weren't. I said, she said she's not promoting you to the 4th grade. What's the difference? I said, well, the difference is you have February, March, April, and May to convince Mrs. Stewart that you are capable and responsible enough to go to the 4th grade. And Mom and I are going to help you. And here's how we're going to help you. We're never, ever again going to ask you, do you have homework? We are never, ever again going to ask you, have you finished your homework? Let's see it. We are never, ever again going to sit down with you at the kitchen table after dinner and help you with your homework and make sure it gets done. We're never, ever again going to answer a question concerning your homework. We're not going to define a word. We're not going to give you an example of how to solve a problem. Your homework from this day forth is your homework. And he said, with the most stunned look you can imagine, Dad, how am I going to get to the 4th grade if you don't help me? And I said, good question, and you won't understand my answer until you're much older if you remember this conversation. My answer is, if we have to help you get to the 4th grade, Eric, then Mrs. Stewart is correct, you shouldn't be there. If you get to the 4th grade, it will be on your merits. And by the way, your mother and I believe that you are capable of convincing Mrs. Stewart that you are capable of going to the 4th grade. And 3 months later, she met with us again and she said, I don't know what you're doing, but keep on doing it. It's like I've seen a miracle. In 3 months, he went from reading 1.5 years below grade level to reading at grade level. And by the way, I think I'm the only parent in America who's never raised a gifted child. I never qualified for the bumper sticker and don't want to. Eric is not brilliant. He just worked hard. She said today, this was mid-April, he is a model student. He's gone from being the worst behaved child I've seen in 20 years to the best behaved child in the class. I started sharing this, by the way, with people through my nationally syndicated newspaper column, which still runs. Newspapers have gotten thinner, so it runs in fewer newspapers, but still out there. It's the longest running newspaper column ever in American history that's been continuously written by the same person. Thank you very much. I started sharing this through my newspaper column, my public presentations, and people started getting upset with me. People in my profession started getting very upset with me because I was contradicting the prevailing mythology. I was saying that the behavior problems clearly enumerated in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, blah, 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 did not require medication. Oh boy. Well, I found out very quickly how deeply embedded my profession was with Big Pharma. My profession, my licensing board, the North Carolina Psychology Board, has since come after my license 3 times. More often than not, probably 90% of the time, when a psychology licensing board comes after the license of one of its licensees, it's because said individual has had a, quote, inappropriate relationship with a client. Somewhat of a euphemism. No, they can't prove I've had an inappropriate relationship with a client because I've never had one. Inappropriate relationship, that is. No, they've come up from my license very blatantly because they don't like what I say. Now, they can't prove, they never have, which is why I stand before you today with my license. They have never been able to prove I am wrong. They just don't like it. It infuriates them that I go around the country and I say, in effect, they caused these problems. They did. They did with their progressive parenting philosophy, which they sold very effectively to the American public. It threw American child rearing completely off track, which is why grandparents, to come full circle, come up to me all over the country when I speak and go, John, what in the world do my son and daughter-in-law think they are doing? What is grandparent alienation syndrome? No, this is a very serious problem in America today. Grandparents who are not allowed to see their grandchildren because the way we deal with children is so dramatically out of step with the new rules. Oh, you can't talk to them that way. Oh, you can't say that to them. Oh no, folks, don't laugh. This is a serious issue. People come up to me all over the country and they tell me they can't see their grandchildren because they call the proverbial spade a spade. Billy, that was bad. You need to apologize. Yeah, and these people are practicing parenting relativism. It's disgusting because it has ruined the mental health of America's kids. I went to a high school of 5,000 students in the suburbs of Chicago, Proviso West High School. 5,000 students. My graduating class was 1,000. We started out at 1,500. There was a tremendously high dropout rate. This was basically a high school that drew from blue-collar neighborhoods. By the time many kids were 16, they decided, I've learned all I need to learn. I'm going to be a plumber anyway. So they went off and dropped out of school and became plumbers or electricians, and they're living in bigger houses now than any of us, you know. This is documented. In the 4 years that I was there, 5,000 students, not one student committed suicide. Not one. I ask people our age, ladies and gentlemen. I take polls as I go around the country. Do you remember a student in your high school while you were there committing suicide? Do you know that I have yet to encounter a person who answers yes? I know he's out there, or she. Okay, I know you're out there. But if I ask this question 50 years from now to an audience of your grandchildren, everyone in the audience is going to remember someone who committed suicide. So we have one person. This is startling. $10 million children in America, are on psychiatric drugs. These drugs, ladies and gentlemen, have none of them have ever reliably outperformed placebos in double-blind clinical trials. The drug companies involved in this charade sometimes have to run hundreds of double-blind clinical trials in order to come up with 3 in which the drug outperformed the placebo, which is the FDA's requirement for a psychiatric drug. These drugs are no better than placebos, but they are different because they have potentially dangerous side effects and they're expensive. And bicarbonate of soda is not expensive, nor does it have untoward side effects. There is no objective reality to any psychological diagnosis, no objective reality whatsoever. If somebody says to you, your son has ADHD, and you say, okay, I want you to please demonstrate to me that he has, that you are using that verb correctly, because this is the verb they use. Your child has, just like they would use the word has for leukemia, cancer, high blood pressure. It's very disingenuous. They use the word has. Your son has ADHD. Okay, show me. Show me. They can't. Because there is no reality to these diagnoses. They are concepts. There is no objective reality to a concept. It is nothing but an idea. If If a physician says your child has leukemia, and you say, prove it, he can show you objective evidence of leukemia. Not so with these diagnoses they are giving our children and grandchildren. And for some of you, great-grandchildren. This is a horrifying scandal. Like I say, they've come after my license 3 times. Why? Because I get up in front of audiences all over America and I say this. And I've had to hire very expensive First Amendment attorneys. And we have exposed in court in Kentucky in 2015 that they can't prove me wrong. They can't. Which is why I won a case against the state of Kentucky in federal court in 2015. Haven't heard from them since. Oh, they've finally given up. They don't want to go to federal court again. So another question I ask people our age. Do you remember your parents having conversations with you about your feelings? Yeah, well, that's the reaction. At an individual level, the person I'm talking to bursts out laughing. Now, I know, there's exceptions to every rule, as we just discovered, but for the most part, people in our generation, our parents didn't talk about our feelings. Did we express feeling? Yes, we did. And I remember my mother saying to me, and this is parenting incorrectness today. The way my mother dealt with this, she called me Bobo. When I was in utero, she called me the Bobo. It just went from the Bobo, or the Bobo, Mr. Bobo, Bobo. And today, at the age of 74, it's Bo, the redneck spelling. Bobo, you are making a mountain out of a molehill. Why are you coming home and dropping this at my feet? What do you expect me to do about this? You live a better life than 98% of the world's children. And you're coming in here crying because they won't give you a turn? Go on. I talk to people our age and they say, yeah, that's pretty much the way my parents dealt with, my outbursts of drama. So what did the mental health professions tell us to do in the late 1960s and early 70s? Let children express their feelings freely. Well, folks, what parents are supposed to be doing is, in biblical terms, training up their children. Training them up. Which requires that in our homes that we simulate the reality that exists out there, to the child's capacity for tolerating that at any given age. Have you ever met somebody who thinks they have permission to express their feelings freely? Well, these people are obnoxious. They're social pariahs. And yet the mental health professional community in America in the late 1960s and early 70s began to tell America's parents, let your children express their feelings freely. You, meaning my generation, you, see, they enticed us with victimhood. You, my generation, you were not allowed to express your feelings freely. It traumatized you. You've got repressed memories. Oh, we didn't know at the time that our mental health was 10 times better than the kids that would follow us. And so we bought into this lie. And we ended up with kids like Eric in 1980. 10-year-olds who were throwing full-blown fits in stores when they didn't get the truck they wanted. John, what are my daughter and her husband doing? What are they doing? They're parenting. This is parenting. Parenting. If there's a timeline in front of us, this is before the 1960s, this is after the 1960s. There is no overlap here. This family was adult-centered. This family is child-centered. These children were no big deal. Raising us was a huge responsibility. We were no big deal. These kids are big deals. They are idols. I came to my mother when she was 85 years old. Brilliant woman, not experiencing any mental decay at all. Physically, bad off, in a wheelchair. I said, Mom, I got a question for you. When I was a kid in either Charleston, South Carolina for the first 7 years, or after my mother's remarriage, Chicago, the suburbs of Chicago. When I was a kid in either of those places and you got together with other mothers in the neighborhood and you talked with other mothers, what did you talk about? What an odd question. My mother didn't suffer fools very well at all. I said, I know it's odd, Mom, but you know I'm this thing called a parenting expert. And I'm curious, I'm just curious. What did you and other mothers talk about when you got together, early 50s, mid 50s? Well, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about politics. We talked about world events. We talked about things going on in the local community. We talked about books we were reading, recordings we were listening to. We talked about trips we had taken or wanted to take. We talked about plays we had seen or wanted to see. We talked about movies we had seen or wanted to see. We talked about our hobbies. We talked about the work we were doing through our women's clubs and church groups. We talked about a lot of things. Why do you ask? Well, did you talk about your children? No. We talked about interesting things. Hey, listen, it may sound funny to people our age, but this is tragic. This is tragic that when women with children today, 20, 30, early 40-something-year-old women with children get together, all they talk about is their children. All they talk about. The female parent in America has reduced herself to a two-dimensional figure. My mother was three-dimensional. I tell women all over the country, one of your obligations is to teach your children that women are interesting people. And I will guarantee you that your child, this is where it starts in the home, your child does not think you are interesting if he is the focal point of your attention in your life. You should be your child's focal point of attention. What are you doing? You need to tell him in many, many ways, you are the most important person here, not him. I understood that. I understood that my mother was the most important person in our household when she was single. I understood that she and her new husband were the most important people in the household after she remarried. Today's kids don't understand this. They don't understand the big people are more important than the small people. That without the big people, the small people can't even keep themselves alive. Because today's parents are acting, I will ask them, who is the most important person in your family? Right out of their mouths. Oh, the kids. Really? Justify that. And see, they don't understand that this new attitude that they are carrying into what used to be called child rearing, if it was called anything at all, this attitude of theirs is the problem. This is why they are having more problems with their children than most of us can imagine, because we didn't see kids like this when we were young. We didn't see 10-year-olds throwing tantrums. We didn't see kids, our friends looking at their parents and going, I'm not going to do that. Calling their parents names. But you see, what's happened, folks, is their parents have reduced themselves. This is the price we're paying for listening to who? Psychologists tell us the family should be democratic. This was one of the memes in the late 60s and early 70s, the democratic family. Everybody was an equal. No, they're not. And it is in the best interest of children to understand they are not the equals of adults. Yes.
10 minutes to go for Q&A.
Pardon me?
Q&A.
Q&A.
I hate to do this. I could listen to this for the next
These
10
people.
hours. Seriously. And I don't have any skin in the game at this point. Okay?
I got you, man.
Anybody
Well, first of all, I'll stay here past an hour, if you will, but not long past, because Paul's got to drive me to Erie. But questions.
The reason is that the rent doubles when we go past 4 o'clock.
I understand. Okay. Well, we'll move out on the lawn if you want to.
By the way, John has books to sign if you
I have
want
one
to.
book.
One book, the book, called the Bible of Parenting, correct?
No, it's the Bible Parenting Code.
Code, okay.
I'm using the word code in its traditional sense, not to, it's a tongue-in-cheek title, the Bible Parenting Code. In the title, the code refers to a set of principles that guide the doing of something.
Okay, John, I was born in 1947, right behind and related to all of your stories.
Yeah.
And just as an intro to the first question here, we welcome you, and I know there'll be a lot of interest in getting your questions answered, so I ask everybody to be brief and short with the questions.
I enjoyed your talk, and I certainly can relate to the things that you've said.
Thanks, sir.
When I was in high school, we had 6 grading periods a year, 24 in my 4 years. I made the honor roll 3 times. When my children were in high school in the early 90s, it took almost a full page in the local paper to list everybody on the honor roll. What do you think about the gradeflation?
Well, let's be brief about this, okay? Because we need to be, you know what I think about gradeflation. This is, this is creating expectations in the minds of today's children that are never going to be realized when they become adults. I mean, every kid, to invoke a name that was invoked earlier, every kid in America today is not going to become Elon Musk. These kids are, when their parents, and see, these people were intent upon raising sturdy, emotionally sturdy people. These people are intent upon raising children who are happy and successful. Okay, to do this, and my parents were not trying to guarantee my success, and my parents were not trying to guarantee my happiness. My parents were trying to raise an emotionally sturdy child. When your goal, and it sounds very wonderful, doesn't it? Well, I asked parents today, what is your goal? What is your mission? What are you trying to accomplish here? Well, I want him to be happy and successful. That is the answer nearly 100% of the time. And they don't realize that in order to do that, you have to become an enabler. You become an enabler. And this is parenting today. This is enabling. And they don't realize that all of this enabling produces a full page in the local newspaper of all the kids in the local elementary school who are on the honor roll, because you can't leave anybody out. Well, you really can't. You pass a certain point and you're committed to put everybody there in some way, shape, or form, that you have to enable. And this is the creation of a mythology about yourself. And this is a terrible thing to do to children. A terrible, terrible thing. These people are not ready, and the mental health statistics are showing this. They're not, when they're 18 or 19. I was married when I was 20 years old. My wife was 18 years old. We were married. We did just fine. We understood reality. To get what you want, you don't whine, you work.
Next question, John.
Yes.
Doctor, I'm horrified by some of the school shootings when you have disaffected young males who have some psychological need. I wonder why the media doesn't show us more analysis of what went wrong with the upbringing of those kids. Do you have any theories about that?
Well, and this does not originate with me. This theory was proposed shortly after Littleton. And the theory is that this is the price that we are paying for instilling high self-esteem in children. See, this is another thing. The mental health professions came along, late 1960s, began using this term, which had never been part of our national vernacular. High self-esteem. Esteem for one's self, which for those of you who are biblically oriented, is clearly, it's called a corruption in the Bible. And they pushed this idea, late 60s, with absolutely no research having been done, which is their habit, stretching all the way back to Freud. And now people have done the research. Gene Twenge in California, Roy Baumeister, the University of Florida. And what have they found? They have found that people with high self-esteem, as long as everything's going their way, they're the life of the party. But heaven help you if you are in a relationship with a person with high self-esteem and you don't give them their way. Women who are married to men with high self-esteem are at high risk of being emotionally and physically abused. This is research, folks. This is not some, off the top of my head thing I came up with. This is research. One researcher, Roy Baumeister, administered a self-esteem inventory to various population groups, the highest scores, even when this was replicated a number of times by people who doubted his results, the highest scores were obtained by people incarcerated in maximum security prisons. And so this is the law of unintended consequences. Didn't it sound wonderful? Everyone would have high self-esteem. And this stuff, I can go chapter and verse on this. We don't have the time. No psychological theory has ever been concerning human nature. No psychological theory concerning human nature has ever been verified.
Next question.
Okay, sorry. Hi, as someone who is not of the we generation you're discussing today, I'm hoping I can ask 2 quick questions, and I wrote them down. But if the discussion of psychology as a pseudoscience from the standpoint of not being able to create controlled double-blind studies of a wide diversity of humans, doesn't the same argument that prevents psychology from being a scientific method studied science also the same argument for individual attention for each human when they're being reared, that some approaches might be more like what Eric experienced, but some children might need a different type of parenting?
Well, it's true that research speaks to a norm, but you can make predictions nonetheless. And there is no research that would indicate that the more attention a child gets, the better his mental health will be.
Okay, second question, more importantly. Say we, as parents, now are to revert back to the child rearing methods of 70 so years ago. How do we account for the mental impacts of social media? Even if we as parents want to be able to abolish it from their lives, it is not possible, and it is their community in which they are to go play in.
Well, I would take exception to your idea that it is impossible. I travel the country. I'm in touch with, through my website, public presentations, and I talk on an individual basis with more parents about parenting, child rearing issues, any person in this country, because before a presentation, I'm not in the green room. I'm in the lobby talking to people as they come in. After a presentation, I don't go to the green room. I'm standing there answering questions from people, because this is why people come to hear me talk. And I'm a man on a mission. This is a mission, this is a ministry to me. And I talk to parents all across the country about these issues. And the issue of social media is a predominant, as the question reflects, issue in American child rearing today. And I happen to know lots of parents who don't buy their children smartphones, who have told their children the first smartphone that you own will be one, A, that you buy, B, you will no longer be living here. Well, no, it's very important. You have to get a job and emancipate. You can't bring a smartphone in this house. I know plenty of parents who don't allow their children any access to social media. I don't know any parents who are doing this who are having difficulties with their children. People think, oh, the kids, they'll be the only ones, they'll suffer horribly. These kids are not suffering at all. The kids who are suffering are the kids who are on social media.
Next question, last question.
Yeah, I was hoping that you could speak to us about the teaching of CRT to our, in our case, our grandkids.
Well, the agenda here is to destroy any proper understanding of what America represents. America is not a perfect country. There is no such thing. You know, human beings are not perfect. We are, in biblical terms, we are sinful, and we have done as a culture and individually sinful things. But the American idea has never been improved upon. America is the only country in the world, maybe Israel, that is not defined geographically, it's defined with an idea. And these people are intent upon destroying that idea because the very idea is threatening to their objectives. Thanks for coming out, folks. Appreciate it.